am calling the meeting to order. This is the June 6, 2019 meeting of the School Building Committee. The Westwood Media Center will be recording. Is there anyone else who is recording? No. Okay, just them. Sorry, I just lost my agenda. All right, so we're going to start off with a membership update. Nancy Hyde has joined our board. She is replacing Mike Walsh, as she is now chair of the Select Board. So we welcome you to the committee.
Thank you very much.
And I don't think we have any other new people since the last meeting, right? Everyone else is the same. Okay. Update on the process with the MSBA. So on Monday, we had our OPM review panel at the MSBA, and that was attended by Emily, me, Michelle, and then Tim was there as well from the OPM, from Compass. It was about 40 minutes long. Tim and his team gave a great presentation that went out for about 15-20 minutes. They asked questions mainly of Compass. Nothing didn't seem like it was too difficult to field. We got a couple questions. They seem to be very focused on the passive house and net zero aspect of our RFS, and how, we just sort of said we have a very robust sustainability program in the town of Westwood, a very strong town administrator. This is clearly going to be one of our goals, and that, that's why we had written into the RFS. So I think they were very interested in that. But those are really the only questions that we got. Yeah. And at the end, they sort of moved forward. And so Compass is officially the OPM for the project. And that was pretty much it, right? Am I missing anything?
No.
Yeah, it wasn't very long.
They talked a little bit about moving on to the designer selection.
Right, as that is the next step for us. And I think Tim will talk a little bit more about that in his presentation.
That is great, though. That was such a tight deadline for you to make that.
We made it.
That was
Yes,
excellent.
yes. And thank you to everyone for that last-minute meeting. That really, we won't do that again. But that ensured that we could get on the June 3rd calendar, so that was great. Okay, so I am actually going to turn it over to Tim and Brian, who are going to present to us.
I know there's no Bruins fans here, so we have a 2-hour presentation.
It'll be quick 2 hours.
Are they playing tonight? Let me give out half of these. And I also have
Charlie and I will be
I put this presentation on my USB and then probably left it on my computer, so I'll be talking further.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for selecting us. Obviously, as many of you know, this project means a lot to us.
Do you need nothing? We can share.
No. Are you all set?
Yep.
Thank you.
Okay.
We are very, very excited about getting going and know a lot of the sort of the history and background around it, which hopefully will give us a head start. So we just thought, I was in talking with Meyer about just kind of would be good to kind of give an introduction of a number, kind of a kickoff about the timeline and the process, and kind of work with, answer questions, which is, I don't anticipate this should take that long. It should probably take 20 minutes, so, please feel free to interrupt or save them if you want. So I thought we would kind of go through the introduction and roles. I know not everybody here was here for our presentation, so I'll probably just talk quickly about the team, and then a little bit about our experience, just to kind of get the ball rolling around elementary schools. Then I thought we would talk about the timeline and what we're looking at in terms of the next year and a half or so. And then the MSBA process, and give you a little more information around exactly what some of the terms that we used, I think, during the interview, which could be confusing. And the MSBA is a very process-oriented agency, so, that it's in a lot of acronyms and stuff, so it's one of those things that you kind of you'll get used to after a while, and they're actually very good to work with. I think you guys felt that when you were there. But, they definitely have a process they want followed, so it's important to them. And then I was going to talk a bit about the role of the school building committee, and particularly in relation to, say, the school committee, and I'm sure there may be some questions around that. It's not, this bit of the presentation isn't extensive or particularly comprehensive around it, but it kind of gives you a feel for what your role is here and your responsibility for the managing of the project in terms of what the MSBA's, eyes are on it. We were gonna talk, they brought up at the panel, the MSBA reimbursement and the whole issue around why districts don't, even though your reimbursement rate is a certain rate, why districts inevitably don't get that rate, because it's that rate of eligible costs. And so we're gonna talk about what does that mean, and Mary Piketty at the OPM panel sort of reminded me that it's important that you folks hear that early, because I think message gets around town about what people are expecting, and it really, at this point, isn't something that's that concrete yet. And then I thought we would end with the next step in the process, which is designer selection, and talk about that process, which is different than the OPM selection, because it's actually run by the MSBA, although we, working with Michelle, would sort of run the procurement aspect of it, but the actual decision is done by the MSBA Designer Selection Panel, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Westwood's not by any means frozen out of that process. It has a major input on it, and, as we get closer to the actual hearing, I'll probably spend a little more time talking about that. So, if you look at the next page, this is the team that we presented at our interview and is the team we have for the project. Brian Jarvis is the project executive. Brian's with me. Brian was our project manager on the fire station project, so he understands Westwood and understands the town's processes and works with the building committee extensively. Chris Kenny is our senior project manager. Chris, his son is graduating tonight from Dover Sherburne High School, so he wasn't able to be here tonight. But he was actually at the OPM panel with me and the Westwood group on Monday. And Emily Sarazin is our site manager, construction site manager, which is, we're talking at that point about 2 years down the road. So I have a page here, a couple of pages on just some of the projects we're working on. I thought the Wellesley project, which these are both ones that we presented at our interview. Wellesley's very relevant to Westwood because they're going through a similar, in fact, nearly identical process in terms of going from 7 neighborhood schools to 6. So there's a consolidation, and the program in Wellesley involves taking 3 schools and making 2 out of them. So one of those is an MSBA project. The other, the Honeywell School is not an MSBA project. They're doing that outside the MSBA. It has a lot of challenges, and in terms of, particularly at that, it's a in-town location, so there's not a lot of site to build on. So there's a lot of challenges around site, and in fact, tonight, that building committee is presenting to the Board of Selectmen and School Committee there about the option, and Jeff D'Amico from our company is there. And it's also net zero energy ready, which by the, just as an anecdotal aside, when we were proposing on projects 2 years ago, we never heard about net zero energy as being a goal for most communities. And in the last year and a half, when we've proposed on probably, and we haven't gotten all these, but we've proposed on probably 6 projects, everyone has made it a focus of their what they want to hear from both us and the designer. So it is becoming essentially kind of the de facto way people are looking at in their communities. It may not be necessarily, and we'll talk a little bit about this, it's up to you folks, it may not be net zero energy, that's going to be a call that needs to be made here, but it needs to be ready for it. So, and I know in Westwood's case, with the addition of the photovoltaic fields that are anticipated, probably can be achieved. So that's a really exciting component of the project. The other 2 projects are the Marathon Elementary School in Hopkinton and the Field Elementary School, which in Weston, which are kind of bookend schools, in that Hopkinton's is pre-K to 1, and the Field School is a grades 4 and 5, so they're two ends of the elementary spectrum. They're interesting schools that we recently completed. We're actually, and might be worth taking a trip to look at, is we're actually getting ready to open the Millis Clyde Brown Elementary School, which is a pre-K to 5 school. It's really quite impressive what they've decided to do there around how they've laid it out. You'll see some interesting things there in terms of, looking at media and library space differently, and so that's something, we can take a tour of that.
Tim, how big is that one? Ballpark, students, or enrollment?
The Clyde Brown School, I'm guessing, is about 90,000 square feet. I think it's 400 students, maybe, something like that.
Thank you.
So, so the next page of the presentation is the timeline that we presented during our interview, in which we presented also on Monday. And I'm going to walk through this, and then some of these acronyms we'll talk in more detail about what the PDP and PSR and SD mean. So with the designer selection, which we've put here in September 19, which, again, we'll talk more about that, assuming that, and I think we'll be close to it, what we would assume is once the designer is on board, the first thing we would recommend, because it also times well with the start of the school year, is to have a kickoff with the community and kind of begin to explain to them what the process is, what they can expect, maybe some initial thoughts around the project, but essentially, we always think it's a good idea to get out ahead of, in front of, the message, and the building committee be transparent around that. So that's kind of our first community forum, kind of an introductory community forum. And these are sort of formal ones, and we would do more if you felt the need for it. And I know we did a lot of these in the municipal task force, project task force. And there's a lot of informal ones where you go in front of various groups just to explain the project. But that's the first one that we've sort of eyeballed here, would be sometime in, most likely after the school year starts up, and in like October or something like that. And then the first submission is this, what's called the preliminary design plan, which I'll talk a little bit further about. Then 3 months or so, or in the spring, we would expect to do the PSR. Now, that is the first formal board vote that the MSBA takes. It's a vote that is when we propose the final, the preferred option, basically, that goes in front of, that would be coming eventually in front of the town. So the board, and in particular the staff at the MSBA, and certain members of the board that are very educationally focused, are really engaged in that, how the decision was made, how does it meet the educational plan. It's a very engaging, that meeting in particular with staff. The board meetings, just as a sort of a backup, are basically pro forma. Everything happens with the staff and members of the board and subcommittee that want to be involved. When you go to the board, it is very much a gaveling through of sort of business, and it's pretty ceremonial. It's like when you were invited into the program. So that's one too.
But I'll add, the other important thing about this schedule is that it's really tied to the board schedule. They meet every other month.
Yes,
So these
right.
milestones are
Could
based on
change.
getting the deliverables in front of the task force ahead of those board meetings, and then lining that design phase schedule up to hit those board meetings, so you're
Right.
approved and moving into the next step.
Yeah, that calendar for next year, I don't think has been set, so these are just rough estimates at this point.
Tim, I'm just curious, so the PDP, the preliminary design plan, and I'm hearing you also say educational plan, which is, I think, what I've been saying, are those the same things? Or
No,
are they
there's
different things?
more, it's
That's a
part
different
of
thing.
that, right.
Part of it.
And we'll get into that
Okay.
detail in the next
Okay,
next
great.
page.
And then sometime probably and so the rest of this schedule, actually, we probably will need to discuss more with the committee about timing of the ballot, and whether people feel it's a good idea to time that with the national election. A lot of people think that may not be a good idea, so I think that's something to just think about. But, the way we set this up, it came out that the schematic design report, which is the preferred solution that you got approved in the spring, further developed to about 30% of the design. And again, I'll go into more about that, but that report, in order to make a board vote in the fall, that would sort of equate to a town meeting vote and a debt exclusion would be, have to be submitted toward the end of the summer. So we'll talk more about scheduling, but that's a consideration people should think about. And then the rest of this process is kind of the design process that some of you are familiar with through the other projects, and that leads to a start of construction in October of 2021.
Right, so the key takeaway here, in addition to the milestones, is that the MSBA process it's a 2-year process. I mean, there's not much you can do to accelerate that. Some of these things can get extended depending on some of the variables within any one of those milestones, but it is a 2-year process, basically, give or take, for the design phase.
Because what's embedded in these submissions, as Brian said, is to get them ready for boards, and then even in design, when we submit to the staff, they want to take 3 weeks to review it, they want us to take 2 weeks to comment back to them, and they don't really want other work being done in that time frame. Now, there's some room there, but that's kind of why these extend out longer than a traditional
But
design.
it is a very good process, it's very thorough, they make you really go through the design, really plan, they do a good job with drawing reviews, they question everything along the way. So at the end of the day, you do have a very good project that is going out to bid or ready for construction, whatever we decide to do.
Can you both comment on that potential timing of next fall? At what point leading up to it do we have some kind of firm sense of the project cost? I know when we did the municipal projects, having a bid in hand was
Right.
very valuable. You didn't say you said bid, but it sounded like it came afterwards. So can you just educate us a little
Right.
bit on that?
Yeah,
And that'll be the next slide,
the-
really.
Well, the,
I can
well,
wait.
the MSB, well, it is different, some in
Sounds like
Westwood
it's
is like, the MSBA does not allow you to wait for a bid.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to get approval at the schematic design phase. So that means contingencies are very important, anticipation of the market at that point is very important. In terms of knowing the cost, definitively, we wouldn't know it until that August submission. We would have if this is.
August 21, the PCD.
0820.
20. Okay.
Yeah,
Are you
going-
saying that you're suggesting that you have to take a vote before you have a number?
No, before you have a bid in hand.
Before you have a bid
yes.
number.
You have a number.
You have a
So
number.
And there's a very diligent process to get that number to be
Right.
clear.
What-
I think we'll get into that with the
What we
next-
did specifically with the
Yeah.
municipal projects was we actually had the
Bids.
Right.
Right.
And that's why I was just trying to understand, because I
Correct.
could tell they weren't saying we would have the bid, but you have to have, and the contingency covers
Correct.
the absence of a firm bid.
Right, and so there are similarities in the smaller non-MSBA projects. You have the flexibility to put your schedule together that way,
Yeah.
especially in some of the non-school projects where firm numbers are more important, simply because they may not necessarily have the backing for those types of projects. The MSBA makes you do that in the schematic design phase, but both types of projects are important, is that we typically don't get into those numbers or publicize what we think the project is going to cost until at least that schematic design phase. And then that's the first number people hear, no matter if MSBA or a non-MSBA project, and that's what they're going to basically hold you to, whether you like it or not, publicly, for the most part of the design phase. The MSBA will absolutely hold you to that as part of the funding agreement once that's finalized. But that's really the first time that you get
Just a little bit
the budget for the
It's a
project.
variation
It is
on
different.
that.
Yeah.
It is different.
Yeah.
So once, and maybe you're addressing this later, but once we're into construction, what role does the MSBA play? Is it minimal? Are they still as active as they are in the process leading up to construction?
They're less active from a day-to-day. They do have a construction team, so they do monitor the construction process as you go through. They typically have a monthly check-in with the project. We still are submitting monthly reports to them as far as budget updates, contractual updates. We still submit every month's invoices and expenditures through the MSBA for determination of eligibility for reimbursement. So it is a financially, they're involved the entire way every month.
Is it a drawdown reimbursement, or is it all at the end? a lump sum reimbursement?
It's a draw, every month you'll get reimbursement. So basically, we'll put together a reimbursement request
Yep.
based on the prior month's expenditures. They'll review that, they'll say your eligibility rate is X, and then whatever was submitted that was eligible, you'll basically get that reimbursement. So you are getting reimbursed as you go along. Something that we keep track of, and you'll get a monthly update on, is how you're doing on your reimbursements, you know, what has been deemed ineligible to date. And then when we get to the end of the process, they basically hold reimbursements at about at 95%, and they say, finish the project, we'll do a final audit, basically. We'll have an opportunity then to maybe question some of the things that were deemed ineligible, and then we'll kind of glean through everything at the end, and then there'll be one final reimbursement that kind of ties everything together.
And on Monday, did they say that that final 5% could take up to 3 years?
Said that.
They said it's up to 2 years, I think she said, but in our experience,
It's been quicker than
it's
that.
been quicker than that. I mean, I don't know exactly why she had that long length.
I think-
I think she said
It
3.
is at least a year, because.
She said 3 to 4 years.
From the end of the project?
She said getting to final audit can easily take 3 to 4 years.
Yeah, I mean.
That,
it-
that I
it-
think is based on
It
the.
might have been a problem. when
Lowering your
Agreed, but-
expectations.
Well, so I think it also depends on the type of project that you have,
Yeah.
because there are things where the building could be done, you could be in the building, and then you have demolition and fields related to another, and then you have
Right.
accepting landscape, you know, which is a
Yeah.
growing season beyond you're actually done. So there are things that could drag on, that could, in
Yeah.
theory, you've been in the building for a year and a half and you haven't done your final reimbursement yet. It could go
Right.
much quicker than that. And that also is anticipating that the full amount of time for every piece of that process is probably taken. So you can definitely streamline and have the package ready to be submitted. But there are things that, until you have a zero payment application from your contractor,
Right.
you can't close out. So that could be hung up for a number of reasons, necessarily not negative reasons, but
And you need your lead certification in there,
Correct.
which can take a while.
the review of that can take months, and then you get the final documentation from that, and that all has to go into that final
But
package.
Hopkinton, as an example, which was occupied in the fall, we expect the final reimbursement by the December board meeting or January board meeting, somewhere in that frame.
Okay.
Now, that is a greenfield site that doesn't have a demo component, so once it was occupied, it was pretty much done. And a lot of projects, there is a demo component that would extend it a bit.
So what we do is, as we get closer to the end of the project, we will have it basically to the dollar of the reimbursements to date, the projected final reimbursement, so that from the town's perspective and planning perspective, based on our experience, you'll kind of know what we think at the end of the day, that final reimbursement's gonna be X, and you can start to plan around
And
that accordingly.
what they don't want is borrowing, like, as opposed to the high school project, which was under the old MSBA, where you had to borrow the full amount and then get reimbursed. This, they don't want they want you to borrow just the amount
As you
that
go. Yep.
the town share will,
Yep.
be projected at. So the next page is a little
Just, Tim,
more.
I'm sorry, one more question. So if we did, assuming we broke ground in October, that would imply 2023 school year start?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right. Yes,
August.
we have a more detailed schedule around it.
Yeah,
but
I
that
Yeah,
is what that leads
two-year
to.
construction is
Yeah.
also reasonable.
Okay.
So in the next page, these are the three major submissions that go to the MSBA. The last two actually get, are the board votes that are taken, but the first one is the preliminary design program. So as Emily mentioned, that the educational program is the first thing, and we'd want to get working on that. You can start, you probably wouldn't finish it until you do your visioning as part of the design, but that's where the educators, in their voice, tell the architect and the designers what they want the building to do. So it's a very detailed, it's probably at least 50 pages and very specific about what's being delivered now in terms of different aspects of the curriculum and how would it be envisioned to change and how would the building be able to help that. As I said, elementary schools now are very different than they were 30 or 40 years ago, and they'll probably be a lot different than this 20 years from now, given the way education is. But that's an important part of that. That is the most important part of that submission, I would say.
And I know you're getting to this, but that's a school committee delivery.
Yes, that part is a school committee vote, yes,
Right,
yeah,
okay.
yeah. And then the initial space summary is the preliminary look at what does the actual table of spaces look like and how big the school will be. So that's when you get a real feel for, and Brian's gonna talk more about caps and whether there are spaces that are ineligible, it will come out of that ed plan. if you justify some spaces that are not necessarily typically eligible or different than their guidelines, they may make them eligible, and part of it is just making sure to justify it, and that's something we'll work with you on. And then the evaluation of existing conditions, that, at that point, is pretty preliminary, but there is an evaluation of the existing, what in this case would be the Hanlon School. The site development requirements, so there's a kind of a piece about that in terms of how the site would be developed. And then there's also, they like to hear at least sort of the long list of what is being looked at as options in terms of, for the new school. So that would be, I don't know how many, because of the, we have a couple of configurations, so that might be 10 or 12 or so options that would be preliminary list there. So that's the preliminary design program. No design has happened, no real architecture involved in that. That's more of setting it sort of sets the tempo and the base for moving forward. And then the preferred schematic report, as I mentioned, is ultimately where the preferred solution is described. And the town has gone through a process of coming up with that, which we explained how we do that, and working with you in our interview, essentially similar to what we did in the municipal task force about gathering criteria. In fact, we use that as an example.
The funneling
matrix,
example where you're
yeah.
starting to narrow down those initial list of options to a few, and then finally identifying the one that is the best fit.
So so it's only 3 items here, but it's actually a pretty extensive submission, and that's a board vote that would be taken. Not a town vote, not a town meeting vote, but a board vote. And then,
This board,
this,
the building committee.
this building committee would take that vote, but not a broader town meeting vote. And then the last major report to the MSBA is the schematic design report, which is the schematic design that I mentioned. Once you've taken that preferred solution, you advance the design, through schematic design. There's 3 stages of design. There's schematic design, design development, and construction documents. And, for sake of argument, there's roughly third in terms of progress. So that is, it's a pretty hefty, it's an important document, and we spend a lot of time going through it ourselves, but we also usually do some peer reviews with other firms to make sure that it captures everything, because to the point of what Nancy was saying, it is the document that gets estimated by 2 cost estimators, one we hire and one the architect hires, and we reconcile, and we need to make sure that we cover all the costs, because that is what the town will vote to approve funding for. So that's an important design program. Then the other items on this are kind of, they're essentially the final design program, which is the final space template and design narratives. And then there's they want to make sure that traffic has been thought out. They want to make sure there are no surprises about the building code in terms of when you do go for permitting, which will happen usually happens after schematic design, you commence permitting, but we would want to make sure we've entertained permitting people ahead of that and understand what's in front of us around that. Same thing around environmental, if there's wetlands or anything around that. Obviously geotechnical. That's when the sustainability portion of the project, which is really important because, especially in net zero, where we're going to be looking at a super insulated building, and that's a much more, that impacts the whole building structure in terms of the level of insulation that goes into it. And we catch it early here, and the police station, we kind of dealt with that. We were asked to look at it late, if you recall, but it was a little late. But this one, we're going to deal with it at this stage where it gets caught early. And then obviously accessibility analysis. The decision around project delivery. So in Massachusetts, you can bid projects, which Westwood has done with the police station and fire station, or you can, and other, I think all their projects have been bid. But now you can use CM at risk, which once we get to that point, we'll do more of a presentation around that, but it's a different way of bringing a contractor into a project. Usually more appropriate if you're doing a renovation or a particularly complex project where it needs pre-construction planning. If it doesn't, it usually is fine to go with a bid, and it's less expensive. But that's something we'll talk more about when we get closer. And then I mentioned the construction estimates, the total project budget, because this is now when, which includes obviously all the other fees and aspects of the project that go into a project. And then that's also where we get the final maximum eligible reimbursement. That's not what you necessarily will get, but it's the maximum amount you could get, once we talk more about those caps and auditing. And then the project schedule is part of that as well. So that's a full report. The board votes it, the board, MSBA board votes it, and that's what the town meeting votes, and subsequent debt exclusion would relate to that. I'm assuming there's a debt exclusion, but I don't, but that's got to be decided, but.
Be decided.
To be decided. So, on the Westwood School Building Committee, I put this little table together because we often get asked about what is sort of the role of the building committee on, and particularly in relation to school committee, and there is a role for selectmen and others involved in the project. So this is sort of a real primer on, and very high-level look at sort of what this committee would vote on. So the votes, as you can see, would be on all the MSBA submissions. And on the major submissions, we need those to be signed off by also the selectmen and the school committee. So the school building committee signs off, the selectmen and the school committee. The major submissions, like the, both of those ones that I mentioned that go in front of the board. So that's why we spend a lot of time also with other boards to make sure they're on, you know, up to
So
speed.
the that first line would be this committee, the school committee, and the board of the select board?
Well, the vote to submit it is by this committee.
Okay.
But you need, the actual submittal document needs to be, the selectmen and the school committee need to sign it.
Okay.
So we've, usually that's been interpreted as they are affirming the vote of this
Got
committee.
it, okay.
To submit it.
And those signatures will be required throughout the project for
There
various
are other
documents,
ones as
so,
we move
yeah.
through, right. And then, you know, the other sort of votes would be around sustainability, because that's an investment and a payback, and there's a cost implication there, so we would probably want to have that structured as a particular vote. The evaluation criteria you'd use to decide the options is usually subject to some vote, and again, that's more of a process we'll get into later. The votes around shortlist and the preferred option are votes that are taken more formally. And then, of course, the project budget and schedule is obviously part of that final preferred option, actually, final schematic design. Then, you know, then other items, these are just big ones. Obviously, at any given moment, there's always, every month, there's something being brought to the building committee to review and comment on. But these are sort of big ones during this phase that, you know, that you would be dealing with. You know, you would be dealing, although you don't vote on the education plan, that's a school committee vote about that we talked about. You know, usually the building committee opines on it or has a chance to opine on it. The instructional technology, which is obviously a big aspect of all of these projects right now, is something that would have a presentation around what that engages, what that means. Community outreach and that whole aspect of developing a communication plan is something the building committee is responsible for, but, you know, and as you know, you have to be careful about advocacy, so that is really about education and not about advocacy, but that outreach and education is the purpose of that. And design elements, I mean, there's just a lot of design elements, systems, mechanical systems, plus the aesthetic design elements, components, that all obviously is something that is taken in front of the building committee and developed. And then the school committee, as I mentioned, has a formal vote on the education plan, and usually on technology, although that often is part of the education plan as well.
That's being done with the school committee before this committee offers any opinion on it, or?
Well, I mean, normally this committee sort of,
Part of
again,
it.
does a lot of the, I mean, in this
Parallel, yeah.
case, you folks are all on this
Right,
committee,
so
so
it
I
doesn't
would
make
say normally it's done in this
Parallel.
committee in parallel, and then, but we need the actual formal vote to submit of the school committee. So does anyone have any questions about that? And these are just sort of rough timeframes based on kind of assuming this designer is selected in the fall.
Tim, I remember when we signed up on something, MSBA, there was something around if we did do districting, the school committee had to approve their redistricting plan. Does that fit anywhere in here? Is that
I mean,
later?
that should be in here, yes. It
Where would
would
that
be
be?
part of the ed plan, but frankly, I should have made that a separate
Separate line
item.
item.
because
And when does that have to be done, ballpark?
You know,
It's part of the education
So
plan.
that would be,
or-
okay.
Yeah,
Right, because that's really
It's-
going
it's
to be a
early.
basis, it's going to be a
Yeah.
basis for the education
Got it,
plan, how
okay.
the building is set up.
right.
I mean, we have to discuss about how she and, that's so totally distinct, she and Deerfield in terms of their location and how that, I know we need to talk more about how the districting would work with those different variations.
If we were to redistrict those two.
Right. Like, I don't know how that's, if you combine those two, Sheehan and Hanlon.
Hanlon, it's very different than combining Sheehan and, Hanlon and Deerfield.
Right.
Correct.
And when does that, because wherever this potential building project gets located has to be determined early on? Because
Yes.
that will impact the
That's all,
configuration.
all part of the
site.
initial stage, correct.
So how does that fit into that approach timeline? When here we sit in June of 19, but just over a year from now, we not only know where it's going to be, we know what it's going to be. So
Roughly how much?
It
I
could-
remember when you walked us through, for this group, when we walked through site options for the fire station too. And we had an exhaustive list of 19.
19 or something like that, correct.
19 sites. I know that's not what we're talking about, but it was a process to determine the criteria and which site fit it, so that at the end of the day, you could say, oh, which one rose to the top? So when are we doing that? Is that this summer into the fall?
Well,
or-
it's.
That's that whole first year,
That's-
basically.
Yeah, but in particular, that's leading up to that PSR in next spring.
Yeah, so next April, May
But-
timeframe this year, we'll be narrowing that down to that, hopefully narrowing it down to that.
And the
option.
designer, once we have the designer on board too,
Oh,
that's
yeah.
key to that piece.
It is aggressive. I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, this is not a really aggressive timeline versus other school projects, but because of some of the particular things dealing with these,
Right.
we have to, so we'll probably lay something out talk more about this, about how do we get, I'm not sure where the public is on all the districting at this point. I don't know what's been
I'm
brought
not
up.
sure the public knows where the public is. I mean,
Right.
people might individually know, but.
So the takeaway, is this is a typical traditional path. Again, if you have a very simple, we're just going to replace this building and nothing is really changing. So obviously, the more variables we add to that, the, the
That's,
rejiggering
I
of the
think is
schedule,
gonna be
so.
why it's so important to be out
Yep.
communicating a lot, because the MSBA does have one benefit to help with the public in that, they have a process that they want followed, and you can't, it's not the town saying, we'll do it on our own. Once you give them a time, you can give them a timeline that's extended if you want, but they'll expect you to keep with the timeline.
And then you're going to help us with that, right?
Yes, yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah.
And the other thing I was wondering, you made the point that there's an education role here, not an advocacy role, but how does it typically go when an advocacy group forms external to this group, leading up to whatever voting takes place at a town meeting and a ballot? Is there a typical timeframe that you see that kind of initiative starts? Is it 6 months
It can
before?
kind of be all over the map, but I mean, usually it would start, 6 or 8 months before the actual vote. But I mean, some people mobilize quickly, but like now, in some communities, but it's not something that, generally speaking, people don't pay, even with school projects, which have more heightened kind of awareness, you'd be surprised how little people pay attention until they start to sense that
Questions coming
there's
their way.
coming in
Yes.
front of them.
But the advocacy group would already be working, they might just not be able to garner much attention to their
Yeah.
efforts.
I think it's
So you're
probably wise for them to start thinking about how they would want to participate.
whoever they are.
Tim, can I just ask another question? I want to hop on Tony's question. So so by April of next year, we submit the PSR, and that's where the preferred option is identified. Okay. But Tony's question about redistricting, you said that would be part of the education plan. So, but how would we be speaking to the redistricting issue if we hadn't determined which two schools potentially were consolidated? See what I'm saying?
We're going to have to work through, this is the same problem Wellesley is to deal with, where you have two distinct school communities. We're going to have to work through, the ed plan probably is going to be focused really on how elementary, not generic, but Westwood Generic Elementary School
Yes.
delivers, and we'll have to probably amend it at some point
Okay.
around that issue.
Okay,
That's
I
how
just wanted
that's
to make
gonna
sure
have to
that it
work.
isn't that by January, that has to be determined, like we were, hypothetically, if we said,
Yeah.
we're consolidating Hanlon and Deerfield, and it's gonna be at the Hanlon site, that's not decided by January?
Well,
Or
I
is
mean,
it?
it's pretty, I mean, to be able to submit
to have
on,
a sense of
on April, it would be
Okay.
well
Kinda
underway.
need to know that.
Kinda need to know
Yeah.
that. Okay, that's.
Now, this may lead why we talked about this extending out beyond the next election, because,
Does it give you a lot of time to hold your various public meetings and forums?
It's tight, we would have to really
yeah,
have a plan and.
we should, I mean,
Yeah,
we
it's
should.
Bob, yeah. I mean, because April's very different than January in my model, because January is like, we get back and we're already deciding versus April, which gives you,
Right.
I mean, on the decision, I mean, leave aside the redistricting. That's where I'm at, I guess I'm
Yeah,
at.
no, I understand.
January or December seems fast.
Well,
but-
considering that we're talking about the designer being
Yeah,
on board at like
right.
the end of September, and we presumably want the designer to be part of some of these community visioning things, right? Yeah, that only gives us
2 months.
a couple of months, right? I mean, that's what it
December
is,
a-
right?
is a
Nothing is
tough-
happening
tough
in the
month,
summer.
right.
Yeah, right in budget season.
Right in the middle of
exactly.
budget season.
So we'll need to talk this out with you probably, and
Okay,
I'll
yeah,
time
great.
out, and maybe we do decide that it needs more time. I mean, there's a balance between hurrying it and being expeditious and setting up a plan and making sure you think about what the roadblocks would be. Because I mean, I will say, I mean, extending it out doesn't necessarily make it any better, it doesn't, the decisions need to be made. It's just a function of how do you make sure that they're made with enough input that they're
Right.
gonna be supported.
One other thing they mentioned at Monday's MSBA meeting was whether or not we want to use a model school. Where do we start looking at that?
So I was gonna put in a thing on the model school, but we don't actually look at that until the schematic design report.
Okay.
And basically, it's essentially what it is. If the right site looks like it's right, and folks are interested in looking at that, we would bring it up, we would make a presentation to you. You actually have to submit to them for the model school. They have to give you models that work. There's no longer a reimbursement around that like there was.
Right.
So, but I was gonna make a model school thing, but it's a little premature to get into it, and I'm not sure, if the site doesn't work, there won't be a model school. If the site's it has to be a pretty level site for a model school to work. But we'll talk more about it if it appears it's viable. And so, does anyone have any questions about? So Brian is going to walk through these caps and.
Right, so when we put together the budget with the MSBA, with their process for reimbursement, and again, kind of coming up with that reimbursement percentage, there are things that they look at either cap costs at a certain level, or there are parts of the project that are just deemed exclusions or ineligible from the get-go, and that affects the reimbursement rate, even though when they might tell you a particular reimbursement rate, as you finish up the design and things come and go from the design, that may, usually never increases the rate, but it most likely will diminish from the final rate that you actually do receive. And there's several types of costs that are ineligible. You have kind of a listing here on this sheet. But there's three major categories. Categorically ineligible, costs that exceed those caps, and then spaces that exceed the guidelines. And basically, the breakdown of those is ineligible, category again, ineligible means they're not core to your educational program. So it's something you want to do to the building that isn't typically the core educational program. There are some, every district has maybe a unique program that's very important to that district. And again, if you can justify it, possibly we can get it into something that's eligible. An example from Marshfield is they had a tradition of a boat building course that was very important to them, and that's, most schools don't have a boat building workshop. So that was one of the spaces where, hey, they had a justification to get that into the program. That space became an eligible space.
And there's all, these are the categories.
Correct, and there's other things that come down at the next page there. But the other things are not part of the permanent building or grounds. Typically, that's circling around particular pieces of FF&E, anything that's not really attached to the building. And then beyond the project scope, I mean, basically, these are things that you want to do that isn't really necessarily critical to the scope of the building itself. That might be, typically it has a lot to do with site elements. And then the MSBA also puts caps for different types of costs, that once those caps, both soft costs and construction costs, they'll reimburse up to a certain percentage. If for some reason the project has costs that exceed that for any reason, they basically cut their reimbursement at those caps. And the 2 pages, they kind of go into that detail.
You know, the next page is that.
I mean, in your experience, how, like, realistic are those caps?
No, they're not
They're
realistic.
not, right?
No,
Yeah.
and,
Yes.
and they were always
That's what I
being
was
brought
afraid
to
of.
the MSBA that these aren't realistic, but their answer, instead of trying to justify them, which is what they were doing for years, they pretty much have, now they're officially tell people, they're not realistic, but because we have only a certain amount of money to spread around, we want to spread it to as many communities as we can fairly, and they're not trying to be realistic about them.
And just to finish off that slide there, the spaces that exceed guidelines sometimes. So again, spaces that are eligible that maybe exceed the guidelines. You want a bigger gym than what they deem as a typical size gym, for whatever reason. You can build excuse me.
I'm sorry, what is swing space? What does that mean?
Swing space is during construction if, most likely in a renovation or addition where you need to demolish a part of the building or take over a part of the building, you have to move the existing program out to a temporary space.
Right, okay.
Swing space, whether that's within a building, another building, something like that. So they're not gonna pay for that.
In the Westwood, in the Wellesley project in Honeywell, there's no room to put the building other than right in the footprint of the existing building. And swing space is the most controversial aspect of that project because
You need to vacate the school.
they don't have other easily available schools to put kids in. So that's the biggest challenge we're working through now.
And Newton actually did that. I think Newton actually they had another school that they used as swing space for a lot of their school projects, where they relocated elementary schools
Right,
to
they had
an
an
abandoned,
extra,
or an
right.
old school, and then they did their school projects, so. So those are the 3 basic categories of exclusions.
Synthetic turf would
Correct.
be excluded? Would they give you an allowance for a lawn, and then you have to pay the extra for the turf? Is that how it goes? How do you do it?
Yeah, that is how they exclude it, but the reality is that gets cut out because it exceeds it'll almost inevitably exceed the site cap anyways.
Right.
Even the lawn would.
So typically with the turf and the spectator amenities, concession stands, things of that nature, they don't necessarily deem critical to the educational program. You know, it's an extracurricular activity, but that's the way that they
Yeah.
kind of look at those. And not every school does that, not every school has a space for that.
Okay.
So if, for example, our Watertown project is a postage stamp, they don't really have athletic facilities on that. So that, again, to kind of keep that consistency, they just say, you can do it as part of your project, it's just going to be deemed ineligible.
The question on.
Yep.
A lot of school systems are trying to push the envelope into what's being taught, like in science, and, you know, things that some might consider academic, but because it's at the cutting edge and new, you know, no one else does it. Is that, you found that to be a problem? We're doing coding in the 3rd grade, okay, now that's not a big cost, but this is something a lot of others aren't doing. So if we want to be innovative about the teaching of science and some things like that, if you're ahead of the curve or whatever,
Right.
is that
Well,
considered
if you
outside?
can justify it in the ed plan, and it's been something typically also, importantly, if it's been something that's been sort of a tradition in the town and like, you know, language is being done at kindergarten, or like, if you can justify it in the ed plan and you can convince them, they'll do cutting edge. No, they have, in the middle school in Natick, we're doing a planetarium,
Correct.
but, you know, they never had one, So they weren't able to convince them that, even though that's cutting edge, because they've never had one, and if they'd had a planetarium and they were, and
A new planet-
they'd
they would get a new
probably be
planet,
able,
yes.
they would reimburse
That would have
them.
been kind of the boat building example from Marshfield.
Yeah,
The
right.
other aspect to that is if you're coding and you have the computer lab, or if that, even if that is how you set that up, the room itself most likely would be eligible. The issue that you could run into, though, is how prolific the technology you put into the building is. They're going to cap your technology budget at a certain rate per student, and whether you choose to exceed that to meet your needs is up to you, but they're going to cap that, and that's something we'll talk about in the next slide. So that's kind of the balance of how cutting edge you are is, sure, you can put that into the total project cost, but that initial reimbursement percentage now, your project costs are now filling up with things that are deemed ineligible, and that reimbursement percentage in theory is going down. So those are the things you weigh. Again, not that it can't be in the project, but it's going to lower the reimbursement rate.
When you get to going to town meeting with a funding schedule that incorporates those extras as part of the town's commitment that they will fund at that level, right?
You'll know by town meeting we'll know exactly what is, going to exceed the
Right.
caps and all that.
So you'll know, and again, you'll know what exceeds the caps, you'll know what the reimbursement rate is, and you'll know, in theory, what you're planning for as you start the project. And again, as you move through that project and things change for whatever reason, and perhaps costs are being put into those categories, and that's something that part of that monthly audit with the MSBA, as they start to realize, hey, you already exceed your cap, you've changed something for the better of the project, but you're above that cap, everything you do as part of that change order is ineligible, so.
By the time we're going to the voters, though,
Yeah.
here's like the project cost, and this
Here's
is the portion
town's-
of it that is the
absolutely,
town's
correct.
cost.
And here's the maximum, it's the maximum portion that the town could receive. And
Right.
that's the big asterisk with, they'll audit that, and if it's 50 and we end up at 48 at the end of the day, basically, a percentage point or two is
They
basically.
do make the town appropriate the full cost.
Correct.
Because of that maximum language.
Yep.
But your planning around borrowing is just around what the projected town cost is.
So just to get a little more detail on the caps, we've already touched on a few. The things that are categorically ineligible, the land acquisition, legal fees, anything you need to do off-site, typically that's mostly related to if you have additional traffic you might need to do, if there's other parts of the program that are, again, affiliated off-site. A lot of times it's mostly athletics. The turf, like we talked about, utility company charges, they just it's different for everybody. Some towns have their own, some towns don't, so again, they just say consistently, we're not reimbursing that. Swing space, permit board costs, any financing costs of your borrowing or anything like that, obviously is off the table. Site remediation, again, because this is every site's gonna be different, it's not gonna be consistent across, so if you pick a site and the site has contaminated soils or something you need to deal with, that's gonna be ineligible, mostly 'cause it's gonna exceed your site cap, but they look at all of those. And then you'll actually see that when you put together the funding agreement, they'll start to show all the costs within the budget that fall into these buckets. And you'll know that from basically as soon as we set that budget. And then they have these little things that they pick out on every project, asbestos-containing floor tiles, it's just these things that they've, over the years, have just deemed, it's difficult to kind of quantify those, it's difficult to be consistent across projects depending on what you're doing. And then auditoriums, that was a recent change, but those have just become ineligible simply because of different sizes, different technologies and things that go into it.
If it's a high school, you can get an auditorium.
Correct, the elementary school level,
The
they
elementary.
typically have those combined spaces, and they just say that's somewhat of a nice to have, but not necessarily a necessity, so.
Middle school too?
Not middle school.
Not middle school.
Can't get it in the middle school. Is that what you said?
Right. You can put it in, but you have to pay for it. It's
Correct.
not-
Or call it a cafeteria?
Well, you can do that. You can do that.
Right, so the Natick is doing, in middle school, they're doing a full-blown auditorium with the theater backstage space, but again,
They're paying for it?
they're paying for that as part of theirs.
What about LEED certified, or how much do they pay for that, or is there a cap, or?
I don't know if that falls into the permit
No,
cost.
that actually gets an incentive.
Correct.
So you want to be LEED certified silver at minimum because you get 2 extra points of
Right, so there's a
reimbursement.
couple things that build into that reimbursement rate. The model school used to be one, but it's not anymore. But LEED certified, again, if you reach certain levels, they'll give you an additional
Silver or gold?
percentage point or two of reimbursement, correct?
silver is the minimum.
Right, and silver's the minimum. MSBA cost caps and exclusions. So these are the caps. So as we start to put together that total project budget leading up to the schematic report, soft costs exceeding 20% of construction costs. So those are things, they have specific costs related to the OPM and the designers of 3.5% and 10%. And 10% is typically an industry kind of measuring stick for design costs anyway of any project. OPMs are typically in the 3 to 5% of a project, depending on what it is. I mean, again, long projects that are drawn out over time could be higher than that. A very complicated design on a very complicated site that has many phases and swing spaces where the architect has, a lot of different things to design, not just a new building on a green field. You could have high architect fees. And then soft costs outside of that, so it's any administrative costs that might go into a project, other things, again, like, that are category ineligible, like the legal fees will be in that. But then they'll just cap the whole thing at 20%. So you could have other project costs for things that might pop up, you could have printing costs, whatever it might be, they'll put everything together into a soft cost, bucket and just say 20% cap. The building cost, they will come up with a square foot. Right now it's $326 a square foot, so basically when we design and estimate that first building, kind of based on the spaces that you have, you're gonna come up with a square foot to build it, and they're gonna say, we're gonna cap you at $326. You can build for $500 a square foot, but we're gonna reimburse you at $326. So that comes into a lot of the fit and finish, the types of spaces, how outfitted those spaces are, and they'll look at all that.
Currently, elementary schools are, they're in the $425 to $450 a square foot, depending on what you do.
So that kind of, that all goes into that equation of 100% of your total budget gets you down to some number. Site costs that exceed 8% of the building costs, typically you do exceed the site costs. It's just the nature of building in the suburban community. You typically have larger lots of land, you have drives and possibly fields you want to do as part of your project. Getting utilities into those buildings, it's not, the little postage stamp in the city where the site costs are low. Most likely, we would exceed the 8% on this, just in our experience. And then anything related to the site that's above that 8% would be deemed ineligible. And then anything that changes, that becomes a change order during construction, you're already over the cap. So if it's site related and they deem it site related, it's an ineligible change order. Furnishings and technology, like we mentioned before, basically a combined rate of $2,400 per student for the two budgets. Basically to fit out the classrooms, bring the technology into the building. You can do more, but they're going to cap it at that rate per student, and that comes down to what your plans are for the building. And some of the specialty spaces that could have very expensive equipment in it. Change orders exceeding 1% of construction. So they've modified this throughout the years. They review this as we move through construction. So every time there's a change order on the project, for whatever reason, that gets submitted to the MSBA. They actually audit that. They look at the types of change orders that it is, and they'll say, oh, this is a, electrical change to this classroom. At the end of the day, it's not really a major scope change or anything in that direction. They might deem that to be eligible. The next change order is something related to, hey, we had to do additional excavation. It's a site cost. That's ineligible. They will review that all the way through the project, and they're going to cap the reimbursements on all change orders at 1%. So if they deem the first change order to be totally eligible and that chews up a certain amount of money, and the next one chews up a certain amount, and then you get to 1%, they'll cap the change orders at that point. And basically all change orders submitted, whether or not it would be an eligible cost, would be deemed ineligible. And they'll hold that, they'll audit that all the way through, but they'll hold that reimbursement until the end, that 95% is part of that final kind of closeout. And that's something we monitor. So we're very close with change orders throughout the project, kind of an understanding of the impact. And you'll be up to date monthly with kind of where those things stand. And again, part of that final projection of what we think the final reimbursement will be will include the change order analysis.
Isn't that a good discipline for the contractors too, to know that anybody with a project is just going to be tenacious about keeping change orders down?
Yes, but I mean, at the end of the day, it sort of is what it is, and then our process is to, make sure that if this is a change, if this is something that we want to do that's a scope change, also knowing whether or not we think there's eligible dollars there.
The contractors tend to like change orders.
Yes, yes. So they tend to like change orders, so they know that we're watching it closely because of this, but from a committee's perspective in deciding whether or not to do something as a change of scope, it's good to know, hey, we can do this, but it's going to be totally ineligible. maybe maybe that helps with
Scope changes
decision-making.
are
Yeah.
ineligible even below
Right.
the 1%. In
So-
other words, that's why it's important to get the scope right during
Correct.
design, and we spend a lot of time working with you and your staff to make sure it's accurate.
It's a design quality too, right? I mean, if the
Yes.
designer doesn't
Yeah.
Correct.
do a good job, that's going to generate change orders.
Which is what drives kind of the process timeline that you just saw. So that
Right.
we've kind of focused on those initial 3 submissions, but there's also those milestone submissions of submitting to the MSBA the certain percentage completion of the design documents where they're doing these reviews. We're having the third party review them from a mechanical perspective, an envelope perspective, an architectural perspective, because again, they're trying to catch as much as they can so we don't get into the situation of you have to do a change order because something wasn't correct in design, and unfortunately, it might not be eligible for you, which is, kind of a penalty to you.
But designers, I mean, we know they're gonna have change orders related to design, they have them, they're not, that's why they have they're not perfect. The designers, we know that, and so we plan for it, but the eligible reimbursement will be limited to 1%.
Right.
They actually do reimburse design-related design errors, but they cap it.
They can't,
What about the cost involved in making sure all the equipment is running properly? I can't remember what the term was.
Commissioning.
Commissioning, they actually provide commissioning
Oh, they do.
outside of the budget,
yeah, so the
So
MSBA
it's
actually.
separate, it's not part of
not
it.
part of
Yeah,
it.
so the MSBA actually brought commissioning in-house to the MSBA. They actually assign the commissioning agents for the project. Typically, they'll have a lead commissioning agent, which is either mostly the mechanical commissioning agent, and then they usually have a sub-commissioning agent that's responsible for the building envelope, the roof, and the windows, and they will work for the MSBA as part of the project team. And the commissioning process typically is one of the items, or several of the items on the lead checklist. And you can actually get additional points on the lead scorecard for doing enhanced commissioning. So it plays a big role with the MSBA projects. So when we do the final budget that the town will vote on, that will include contingencies, both from an owner's soft cost perspective and from a construction change order perspective, will be included in those budgets. And then those are the budgets that then will get audited as we move through construction with what we decide to use contingency for. That'll be part of those final reimbursements.
So at the end of the day, for purposes of managing expectations, what is the deduction from our reimbursement number? That's the average deduction in terms of, meaning if we're, if our reimbursement number is 34%, what's the realistic actual reimbursement that we're gonna get?
It varies, I mean.
Yeah, it does vary, but I mean, it is in the 7 to 10% sort of difference.
But right now, I mean, so our base, they've already told us our
Base is 34.
34, and we have been told by the MSBA that we're getting 1.93% for the maintenance plan.
Which is very good.
Yep.
Thought that was good. 1.93%, and then presumably, if we're focused on net zero, right, we would get some, so we're up to.
37, 38.
Right.
So even if we're down 10, we're
It
still
could be, say, it's a-
fairly close to a
Yeah.
third.
30%, 30% reimbursement,
Right,
sure.
a third, right,
Sure.
yeah.
Although we should emphasize in the community engagements
Yeah.
that I would say 25 to 30
Right.
is really what we're,
Right.
But there's another way of looking at it, because that almost sounds like we're being punished for it. What it is we're actually getting 36% on a portion of the project. We just have to be careful how you
Yes. That's a
describe
good
it to the
point. Yeah,
public.
right.
Because it's not like it's doing anything wrong if there are standards of education programs that you want a better building
Right.
than what can be reimbursed on. You may get 36% on that.
Right.
yeah.
We're
and we
going
can
So this thing's
certainly
important to
discuss-
us, we're
Right,
gonna.
and we can
It's a
certainly
blended
discuss
rate
how
is
to
what
frame
happens.
it.
Right.
Right, and we
Yeah.
can discuss how to frame it.
Yeah.
From a practical effect.
From a practical effect, yes, it's a blended rate.
Right.
Yeah.
It's 0 on some things and it's 36 on
Right.
others.
Right.
Yep.
There are some things like fields where the contractor that's doing the construction of the building is not necessarily very good at doing the fields and may hire, sub it out. It's at the end of the project. The experience that I've seen with other projects here is you'd almost be better off bidding the fields separately. And if they're not reimbursable, it doesn't matter, right?
Yeah.
Well, the synthetic turf the synthetic turf itself would be non-reimbursable,
I
but
don't
if,
think we're talking about synthetic turf.
but a field itself could possibly be
Yeah, it's
in the
probably-
project, but
probably
again, it's
not.
if you exceed that
Yeah.
cap number.
It may be worth it. I mean, it would need to be pretty distinct, because what you don't want to do is have like any coordination issues between, where you'd have two separate contractors pointing fingers at each other. I mean, the one good thing of having a general contractor or a CM do the work and then sub out the site is they own the responsibility. They may not, depending on who they use for subcontractors might make a difference, but you don't want to have you wouldn't want to have a situation where they had to rely on each other, like one to do rough grading and one to do the finish, and you could end up with a real mess. It's just something to think about. I think as it develops, we can talk more about it. So the last item that we were going to, does anyone have any questions on the caps or reimbursement?
It's very confusing, but
I mean, we'll go through it. When the actual number is
yeah,
ready,
when you get,
we'll walk through it.
when you get the
in
first
detail.
breakdown, we'll go through kind of line by line of why things are deemed a certain way.
This is a little premature to bring this up,
Yeah.
but the reason why they want you to bring it up is exactly kind of what you guys were getting at. They don't want the public to have the wrong impression about it.
Right. It's really the setting the correct expectation of what that final percentage could end up being, and not having a, false message maybe, so being out ahead of it.
So the designer selection process is the next step. That's what we're working on now. And designer selection is done differently than OPM selection in town. So it's done by the MSBA designer selection panel, which is a total of 15 members. 12 of them are permanent appointed members that are on, I think, 1 or 3 year terms. And then the district is given 3 seats at that panel when they do your project. And so, which it's 3 influential seats. It's more influential because they always look to the district to give their opinions first, and the other people around the panel want to hear what the district says because they don't want to saddle you with a designer you don't want. But it is a decision that's made by that panel, not by this panel, not by this board. So on that district, the 3 members by regulation is a representative from school committee, the superintendent or their designated representative, and the CEO, or, that would be in a town, the board of selectmen, or their representative, designated representative. They go through, the firms all are pre-qualified by the MSBA, but that doesn't mean much because, there's a full procurement that occurs. They'll submit proposals to the town. There is going to have to be an MBW, both in the construction and the design participation, because this is state funded, so that is an important element. So we end up getting, they have to find that through sub-consultants usually, typically. We usually manage that process. We'd probably, in this case, because of Michelle's experience, we'd work with you about procuring it, but for the MSB, ultimately, they kind of control it. We just sort of, so we do the draft of the RFS, we do the walkthrough and the reference checks on them and kind of set it up for this panel to deal with it. And they don't want, on the district reps that I mentioned, they don't want you to pre-rank them. The reality is that you do pre-rank them, and that's something we'd work with you about, is how, whoever the 3 are to go in. But this committee doesn't take a formal vote ranking them. It's just the 3 members. They have loosened up. They used to didn't even want this committee to talk about it, but they've loosened it up where now you can, in an open meeting, if you want, talk about the different proposals. But it's just to talk about them, not to do any ranking or, qualitative kind of analysis around them.
You could have a vote, in theory, that 12 members of the MSBA voted one way and the 3 people from the town.
In theory,
I'm not saying that would
I've
happen.
never seen it happen, to be honest.
I'm not saying what happened. It's
Mostly the only time I've seen when the district didn't kind of get their initial was when, and it can happen, is when you shortlist, and then usually there's almost 90% of the time there's an interview of the shortlist. In the shortlist, we always recommend districts be on the same page, so you rank them because you want to maximize your vote. But when the interview, you can't speak to each other or anything, so you could literally, and we've seen it where the district has split 3, they voted for different people for whatever reason, because,
Symbols.
Right.
yeah.
Signs. Indicator.
But they are very, we just went through it in Wellesley, actually, for the Hardy School, and they really do actively court the district's opinion. And
Okay.
they're very conscious of that. And then in the end, they don't, the fee is negotiated by the district, and they don't negotiate it. So we would work with you to negotiate the fee and set up the scope of work. And there's a lot of, as you know, there's a lot of information around what the fee should be. So that's the selection process, which and we're going to start right away, actually, with this RFS, because they are backed up. And so we're being, I'm not even sure that the last page, I'm not sure that this isn't aggressive, even if we need it, because that's why we want to get, it's first in gets the spot. So we need to get to them, that RFS. So we want to target to get that RFS out as quickly as possible. So we'll have it to this committee, and we'll probably send it, we need to talk about how we want to do that. But we would want to get it to the MSBA as quickly as we can. So I've got 6/17 here, but if we can do it earlier, that would be better. Because that's what secures our spot.
Do we need any votes of this committee tonight?
No,
Okay.
no, I mean, you don't have anything, but when you do get, and I know you mentioned about that OPM RFS being voted, and you had to come back and do the vote. This is a little different because it's not you're not making
Right.
the selection, it's the MSBA, so typically, you don't need a vote of the committee on some do just because they want the public, they want to do it as a public record, but
But the MSBA
the
won't
MSBA
require us
won't
to vote
require
on the
that.
form.
No,
Or to release.
no. In fact, because it's really their RFS, it's
Right.
not yours. So, if there's a couple of options, you could, if, we could send it around to everybody, and then you could give us comments, but, we tell you we need them pretty quickly. There's not a lot of room, by the way, for commenting. It's a form RFS like the OPM. There's very little changing to it. There's no, so we could do that and send it around, and, my suggestion is that you appoint a little smaller group with Michelle and somebody, whoever you feel, to kind of, that we would be able to work with through any of the little bits and pieces of it. There isn't a lot of, it's just not that difficult, because there isn't a lot of options around it. Have any thoughts about it?
I mean, would it make sense to have it be Michelle and then the 3 people who are going to go beyond the designer selection panel?
Yeah, to review it.
Worked the last time.
Sure.
Does anyone else feel like they want to be on that review panel, the review of the RFS?
My suggestion would be is you send your recommendation to everybody, and everybody goes to these 3 people with their recommendations, and you have the input from everybody, but it's 3 people absorbing everybody's comments and putting something together.
We can do that. It's a tight time frame.
And if we send it to everybody else, I would say we shorten that time frame, because if we're combining, 10 people's comments,
It's going to be a lot of work
It's,
to
I'm
do that.
probably gonna say-
A day to respond.
yep,
If you don't-
24 hours, get it back.
They don't hear from
So-
you.
Yeah,
We're
read it.
moving on.
Read
Yeah.
it.
If we're making a subcommittee, why would we do that?
Yeah.
I'm sorry?
The reason for the
Exactly.
subcommittee is so you don't have to have
Right.
everybody's, I mean,
Especially
understand.
since there's not that much you can
Right.
opine on, is that
Right.
correct?
It's pretty much a template, right?
for
So-
efficiency,
yeah.
I mean, I think the subcommittee should
Yeah.
just,
It's basically just getting the
agree.
process started.
So let's back up and to finalize the subcommittee, the committee that will actually be presenting.
Yeah.
So representative from school committee, superintendent, and select board, right? Those are the 3. So it probably makes sense, Emily, me, and Nancy? Does that make sense? Any objection to that? Nope. Okay. So for reviewing the RFS, the 3 of us and Michelle.
All right, that's,
Is that okay? Does anyone, Charlie, is that all right?
Sure,
Do you- I mean, you're welcome.
Just so we see it, you may not want our comments, but I think I'd like to just see what it is. If
Yep.
You don't need my comment.
When you send it, do you send it redlined against the form?
yes.
Okay. So you'll see the changes that were
They
made to the
make you
form.
do that.
So maybe what we'll do is we'll send it to everyone, you can review it if you want. But I think the commenting will limit to just the 4 people, unless you see something egregious, Charlie, then call me.
And again, like Tim said, this is actually not our thing.
Right, this is
Yeah,
the
so
MSBA's
We just
thing.
need to make sure
Yeah.
we've got our concerns covered, which I doubt we'll have much.
And you should vote at some point that those 3 members should have be voted. But you can do it now, or you don't
Vote.
have to,
Yeah,
because
let's-
it's not,
3 members to
that have
be-
been, that you've
Those are
appointed.
3
to the designer selection
Yeah,
panel.
correct, we have to notify
So
them.
do we have to nominate?
You don't have to do that.
So I think we just need a motion, right? A motion to appoint Emily, me, and Nancy to the MSBA designer selection
So
panel.
moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, motion carried. Okay.
Who's taking minutes? Is it?
John, behind you.
Behind you.
Wasn't being recorded,
Were you?
so you gotta-
I know, that's what I was worried about.
I have all the important stuff here.
All right, so you'll get to us the RFS by the 10th. And we want to get it to them by the 17th, but earlier if possible,
Yeah.
right?
So next
I'm gonna
week-
try to
next
get
week.
it out tomorrow.
Okay.
It's basically turn around next week.
So if we get it on the 10th, what
That's
do you?
Monday.
Right, I'm just looking at the calendar. What if we get our comments in by the 12th or the 13th? Is that too tight? Is that good?
Sound like it's.
I don't think there's going
There's
to be
not a
much.
lot of creativity
All
going
right, well,
on.
then why don't we say the 12th?
12, got it.
It would be
June 12th?
helpful if you could send the OPM one in Word document to me, so, because a lot of it is gonna take that background and.
Descriptions and things.
Okay, so comments back by June 12th. And then hopefully you can just turn that around. And you guys will be the ones to send it to the MSBA?
Yes, yeah. Yeah.
Can I ask though, Michelle, would you be giving it a first look before it comes to us? Or does
I
it
mean,
just come
I
to all
can-
of us together?
I think all of us together.
Yeah, but I mean,
It's so
it's a small
straightforward.
group and it's not a big document, so
If it's anything like the
Yeah.
OPM,
I don't,
it's a very detailed boilerplate that you just plug and play.
yeah.
It is.
If there was a lot of decisions making, I would definitely scrub it
Okay.
first, but I don't think it's worth that.
You're-
And then
you're
you,
not expecting
and then
it.
I don't want to cut into everybody else's time.
The only items in it that have any sort of really customizable point is the things that you want them to focus on, the critical sort of objectives that you want. So they give like 3 or 4 or 5, but then, you know, you might.
Example.
Well, like
Zero
net
energy.
zero
Net zero would
energy
be
is
the
the
big
most
one.
obvious. I
Yeah.
mean, you know.
We had those in the RFS for the OPM.
Yeah, so they're probably
It's
gonna
very
be the
similar,
same as that.
very similar.
Yeah.
I didn't, you
And
know,
we
I
tailored
didn't
that a
look at
bit
those.
to focus more on passive house. We added, there was a little bit of language difference to add passive house versus just.
Yeah.
So, I mean, very little.
But we'll probably, as a start, just take what you put in the OPM and then you can
Yeah.
adjust them. And then we'll just customize and, yeah, that would be great. The quicker we can get it in, we'll get our slot in line, so.
And is it safe to assume that at this point, in fact, you will do all of the submissions to the MSBA? Are we
We
done
do, we do.
submitting things?
No, we do
No,
it.
you do it.
Everything has to go through us. They
Yes.
want you to go through
Right.
us, so.
Everything else
Perfect.
is-
So you get all the
That
votes, all
plan.
the.
Great answer,
So
yeah.
you get all the votes, you'll get all the answers. We'll give you copies of all of them, you have all the
Yes.
binders and everything, but.
Yeah.
Vacation time for you, Mayor.
Really do.
Okay, great. Is there anything else on this?
No?
Does anyone have any other questions?
Next meeting?
Yeah, so so the next item on, do you have a list of the committee and contact information?
No, we could use that.
John, do we have that somewhere? If you could send that, oh, it is? In our packet. Can you send that electronically to Tim? That would be great. Oh, yes, here it is. This has Nancy.
You distribute the
We'll get, here, you can have that for my meeting.
Yeah, if we could get on that distribution, that'd be great, and then we'll file those, and then we'll have everyone's.
John, feel free to add cell phone numbers if it's okay with the other members.
Yeah, is it not?
Oh, it's okay. My number's already, at least it's okay.
Mine is not.
It's not okay for you.
Don't give out her
All right,
number.
don't give out Emily's.
Oh, yes.
I guess.
We'll have the email just float.
Yeah. Okay.
So you have it in your records.
All right, so next item is future meeting dates. Tim, at this point, once a month it still works, right?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. So, we're getting into summer. July and August. So right now, we're at June, what are we, June 6th. Thursdays, I think we should try and avoid. Well, I guess, just because school committee's always on Thursday.
Well, we don't meet in the
We
summer.
don't meet in the
Summer, people go, I don't know. Usually I think Tuesday, I don't know, summer people sometimes take long weekends, but
Yeah.
who knows?
It's a roll of the dice.
It's all nice.
Okay. Well, how about looking in July, how about July 9? That's a Tuesday.
Does this allow for call-in, just like other open meetings?
We have to have a quorum in person,
Yep.
but people can call in.
Yeah, I would need to call.
Me too.
Let me just, hang on,
What, can I ask a different, maybe while on the conversation, I mean, Tim, July, it's summer, so do we need one July, when
No,
would,
I mean, to be
when would
honest,
you when you would you
I was
suggest
just
that?
thinking about what the business would be for July 9th. There really wouldn't be any. The thing that we need to probably do, which I think we should do and set up for this committee, is the idea around what the public information campaign
engagement
is.
one?
Right.
So like, I don't know, my guess is that's probably trying to set up a meeting with you and talk about that, and then be prepared to come here with some thinking around that.
Yeah, and I think that from our perspective, the summer would be a great time to start working on that
Yeah.
educational plan as well, so I would love to talk more
Right,
with you about that.
right.
But yeah, so the question.
Because
is
I think
what-
that's probably, there's no other business around, the designer selection just happens.
Yep.
And until we have a designer, we could do some things if you wanted, but it's not probably gonna improve the timeline like we could do surveys of the building, the hazmat surveys and things, but I'm not sure it's going to improve the timeline that much, and by the time we get them on board now, it might not be able to be before school, so it wouldn't be any benefit. So I think the big thing is this whole broader conversation around how to begin the process of discussing redistricting and
Right.
Getting the public's opinion on what we should do, isn't that what
Right,
we're trying to
Right.
do?
Well, we talked a
Right.
bit about that at school committee.
Yeah.
I think we thought in July we would really think about, knowing what the plan and the timetable and having the dates on the calendar for those community forums so that we can really roll them out as soon as school starts.
Based on your previous experience, when would you suggest such meetings begin? How many should they be around the community, and what are some of the topics you would suggest?
Well, I think it's, I would say that, I would start them sooner than later, because it is more of a listening to people. The beginning is really going to be a listening. So I don't know enough about the dynamics around the potential around redistricting. I need to get more information to say like kind of what my thoughts would be about that, but I would say earlier, getting that communication.
By September.
Well, sometime, you have to there's not much happens in the summer, so
Right.
I think it's really,
You start in September.
it's starting in September when people have settled into the school year and done their
Back and
parent nights and
refocus
all
it.
that sort of thing.
So our intention had been, Tony and I talked about when the school committee meets in July,
Right.
that we would talk, and that would be, a significant portion of the agenda was to think about that. And so I'm just wondering if it makes sense to have the school committee have that conversation with us first, and then maybe we could say, here's sort of what we're thinking, and throw it out to the rest of the committee. People comfortable with
When
that?
are you
Certainly
doing
if
a
you have
retreat or
ideas.
something?
Good plan.
Yeah, we're gonna have
Good
a
plan?
retreat.
Okay, right.
So it looks like working backwards, if we have sort of the community kickoff on this, it looks like it's sometime in early October, right? The designer hopefully will be on board by mid-September. So, and we have this in July. So the next meeting of this group, it doesn't sound like needs to be until September.
Yes, unless something gets accelerated.
Right. And in that case, we just call
Yeah,
a meeting.
right,
Yeah.
right.
Beginning of September, maybe.
So I would,
That sounds better.
that does sound better, doesn't it?
But
Well, if you do stuff before curriculum night,
Yeah.
people are gonna go crazy on you. I mean,
yeah, we
as a
can't.
parent,
When
I
is
wanna know curriculum night,
it's
Well,
like the beginning of October, and then
3 different agreements.
anything,
Then talk to
any
me.
The month of September.
program you got going on, then I'll listen to.
But
First, I gotta get 'em to
that is
school.
is that enough, does the principal speak
They do.
to the whole group? So that would be a time to at least get, at least the idea of,
Or at
maybe
least
set up the meetings. that
advertise.
here's where the
Say, come
meetings are
out
gonna
on,
be,
yes,
where-
yes.
You know, to get people's focus.
Right, right.
Yeah, and maybe have someone from this committee go to those.
Sure.
and just give a little PSA.
So if this group were to meet again at the beginning of September, I'm going to throw out a date, September 5th? I mean, that's like.
Wednesday or
it's a
Thursday, the first,
Thursday.
of the first week?
Thursday of the
First week, I mean, we'll have been back for a couple of days.
We don't have, and school committee's on the 12th,
Yes.
right?
Does that work?
Does that work?
Everyone okay with that, September 5th? We just got our summer back.
Nice job.
May, I would need to call in for that as well.
Okay. Anyone else? I just want to make sure we have quorum here. Everyone else is good in person? Okay. Do we want to just set the next meeting in September? I think that makes sense. Meaning,
Yeah.
not go further with the meeting
Yeah,
plan?
right,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Okay. Okay. So September 5th will be our next meeting. Another item for discussion is Westwood Media Center coverage of future meetings. I know, John, I'm going to, why don't you just give us a little overview of your thoughts? You're on the board, correct?
I'm on the board. So I'm on the Westwood Media Center Board. I'm actually president of the board. And so we actually talked about it, and we're trying to do as much as we can for the town, but unfortunately, we can't do everything. And everything has a cost. And right now, we're financially, we're right at the cusp of people cutting cords. Nationally, it's somewhere between 10 and 20%. It's a little less for Westwood. But we are noticing quarterly less and less money coming in. The FCC also has a pending ruling that could marketably or drastically reduce our fees as well. So we're contractually obligated to take all the school committee, all the select board meetings, the FinCom meetings, and the planning board meetings. But we don't do, for example, like the housing authority. We don't do the trustees of the library, also voted in. We don't do the permanent building committee, which is an appointed board. So we'd love to do everything, and if there's a big meeting, we'd certainly cover it with community involvement, that kind of thing. But if we covered every single meeting, the cost is about $500 a meeting. So these 2 meetings we just did really is going to cost us ultimately about $1,000. So it looks like we're going to have somewhere between 15 and 20 meetings. That, for our small budget, that's huge. And not only that, but our handyman Connor here, he not only does he do an awesome job, but he doesn't get paid overtime to come take the meetings. He has to reschedule his whole day, which means he's not in there during the hours that he's at these meetings. So if there's something specifically important, we're in, we'll do as much as we can. But if not, if we really want to have this done, every single meeting, well, that's fine, but perhaps we should budget that in, just like we do the attorney's fees and the architect fees, and then there you have it. But that's something, I think for the whole board to decide, but that we just can't cover everything in the town that we'd like to.
Right, no. What do people think? Yeah,
A few
Tony,
thoughts.
go
So,
ahead.
I guess my reflections, especially after tonight, this was really a lot of content that, I think this is great, valuable, and we have one member of the public, thank you for coming. I guess my thoughts is this really isn't, I can't speak, I haven't been in the school committee as long as other people, but this is a big deal, both when we talk about potential consolidation, one, potential redistricting, two, potential, I'll say for the cameras, maybe the biggest debt exclusion in Westwood history. This isn't a small deal. And I guess my other impression is between now and April, like the next year is probably the most, once we get into carpet, and I don't want to minimize what happens after a year, but the next year, even not even next year, I say between September and April of next year, I don't know how many meetings it'll be, 6, 7. That's going to be a lot of content. I think it's important for people to hear from this. I even went online, and I know that's not all, but something like 80 people would watch the average school committee meeting. and actually 60 people have watched the previous meeting of this. So people online watch, I think people watch on the television. I don't know, I guess I'm of the mind, and I would leave it to maybe your discretion. My preference would be leave it to your discretion, the chair, which is if it's something content, with decisions being made, or something like today, content. If it's something procedural, like we had a couple weeks ago, yeah, I don't think we need. But I guess that's my view, especially between now and April of next year, and that's, I guess, my view.
And what about building it into the budget? How do people feel about that? That if we do feel that there's a meeting with content, that would be something that we would pay for?
I'm just curious, I mean, in terms of like the feasibility study budget, would this be something that could be considered part of that feasibility study process, or would that be outside the parameters of what we can spend the money on? Or do you know?
Yeah. I would think it would be in the, kind of the miscellaneous category under the feasibility.
How
Part of the community
tight is
engagement?
that budget? I mean,
We haven't seen it, I have to work with somebody about getting the budget.
Yeah.
Or
Okay.
doing it with you, but is it town, is it private?
Westwood Media Center is part of the town via contract, like,
I don't think it would be reimbursable.
the Board of Selectmen, or the
Yeah.
Select Board started it,
Yeah.
and then
It's
its
a town fee, right?
Yeah. Would be.
task is to
Right
budget
now,
and
it's
run it.
funded through a pass-through
Yeah.
from Comcast and Verizon. What John was referring to is we aren't sure that will
Oh,
continue
I
to
see
be.
with the fee, yeah.
For now, that's their revenue source,
I mean-
primary revenue source. Correct?
Yes.
My thinking is this is a very public process, and, the last thing you want, the part of that makes projects not succeed is if there's an appearance of a process that's not happening in public, and the more you can be transparent around that, the better.
I think it's worth
Yeah.
exploring in this process whether we could get reimbursed for, this is a public participation process, okay?
I think he's saying
Maybe
no.
not.
We
Uh,
probably
No,
can't
but
get
it-
reimbursed
But to
for
be
that.
honest, it's
Right.
not that
It's not
much,
like a
not
huge
worth
amount of
it.
money.
Yeah.
I mean,
Right.
it's- yeah.
I think what Tony said is probably the biggest financial decision the town's gonna make in the next few years. And all hell is gonna break loose in the not-too-distant future with opinions and all of that. So I think the more education that can be done, the better. I also feel that we have had meetings, we just come for a vote or something, and I'd like to leave to the chairperson, make a decision, when maybe it's not worth $500 for, nothing important's gonna happen, it's just procedural, but I do think there's an awful lot of very important things that are gonna happen that, of all the different rankings of the different groups we do, this is gonna get very important in the not-too-distant future.
So, John, you said two things, basically. You said there's cost, but there's also a manpower issue. Am I right?
We have executive director and two other people, Connor and Maggie, that work for the Westwood Media Center. If they have 3 meetings, we know that the select board is first. After that is a school committee, FinCom, planning board. I believe that's the order. Generally
I
speaking, they all.
think we're all on a level playing
They're
field.
all-
I think that would be a better way to
Essentially,
put
the
it.
select board gets to say, hey, we want you to cover our meeting first, and then, we might have to sub out, so it would cost more than, the estimated $500, if we have to bring in more people to cover the meetings, because we have to pay them, and they get paid, considerable. Because there's setup time, breakdown time, editing time, and putting it up.
So
time.
yes, there's a manpower issue.
Yeah, and I'm not saying, I hear the whole point on transparency, it's very important. But if we're looking to save funds and we have a manpower issue, and this is a, sort of a subcommittee, if you will, I mean, it is and it isn't, but is there some way that we could report out at school committee every time on what transpired here? And then, so it would be a standing agenda item, and that way, we're already recording at school committee. So you're covering it, and you're not gonna get every nuance, everything that every person said, but you would have to report at every school committee meeting what transpired. I'm just trying to think of
Yeah.
a way to
No,
save, and also, there are 60 to 80 people, that's true, but this town is, it's a relative, I'm not saying those aren't important people, but that's a relatively small number. But if we want to be transparent, but we also want to be cost conscious, maybe we work this into our agenda, and that way we continue with transparency. We also continue to tell people at our school committee meetings that these are public meetings. Certainly, you can attend, here are people you can call. I'm just trying to think of an alternative.
I think this is different than the Public Building Committee. I think it's a project that is going to have a lot of eyes on it. It really is, particularly once we start the community engagement process. People are really going to focus on it. I'm a little reluctant to make it part of the school committee because it's a board that's bigger than the school committee. And,
Well, I'm not making it part of
No,
the
no,
school
I mean the
committee. I'm just saying
reporting
an
out.
agenda item.
right, but I don't know, I sort of, I'm a little bit more I like the idea a little bit more of looking at the agenda each time and making a decision of, is it worth taping it? Because there are a lot of people who are watching this on.
And then the ones that you don't tape, though, you could still.
And there are minutes.
Right.
There are always minutes.
There's always
There are
minutes, and
minutes.
they're open
Post
meetings,
them.
anyone can come, but the ones where we're really talking about content, for example, the September meeting, I do think probably should be taped, because we're going to be talking about things, we're going to be talking about the designer selection process, right? We're going to be talking about the community engagement sessions. So now, I'm not opposed to putting it into the budget either. I mean, if it really is a financial hardship, I think in the grand scheme of this project, it's
not-
very
it's
small
not much
dollars.
I don't think that anyone would think it's financial hardship, it's just.
No,
just a
for
consideration. Oh, I didn't
for
mean-
them. No, I don't mean in
Oh,
general.
For you, I
For-
get you.
For you, John.
May
I think we can
I
all
think
put
what
the
We
I
appreciate
think you're
that.
on to the right answer. There should be a judgment call on the meetings
Yeah.
and the substance. If it was a procedural meeting to approve something, to get it
Like
off to
at
the
the,
MSBA.
right.
That
Right.
clearly, doesn't qualify. I think what we have to do is look for a way to find the most effective way to make sure Westwood Media Center can be here.
Right.
And I think we can take that offline and say, how do we do it? What's the best way?
Right.
I think Mike, Pam, John, you guys can come up with the answer.
I agree, but I think it's, I
Yeah,
agree.
we shouldn't be cutting corners as to what is aired or available on video.
Right.
We should be finding a way to make that
To
happen.
make it work, right.
And I would say, I think that school building project update should be a standing agenda item at the school committee.
should be
meeting
anyway,
really, more is
right,
better, we'll
right.
just.
I'm a little reluctant
Talking
to
all the
recap.
time.
before you do this.
That's
You wanna
right.
add to
No,
the
no.
publication, not-
That's right.
No, we just have other things to do.
Give you the
Yes.
elevator.
So it's
Not-
going
not
you
the
should
blow by
be
blow.
only- I'm not-
I actually started, I think it
What?
should be at
No,
our
honestly.
meetings as well. Maybe a different level of coverage, but
Yeah.
just keeping the board apprised, because as Tim and Brian mentioned earlier, there are points where we have to sign off on things.
Yeah.
So the board should be sort of getting a gauge as to what's coming up next and where things are in the process. So we would do it at an edited version, but I think we should too.
Yeah.
It's a town matter.
It's
not a
a
school
big
matter, it's a
town
town
matter. It's a
matter.
town matter that's on everyone's mouth and lips, and everyone's talking about it.
Right.
Or soon will be.
I already is. I mean, you hear it
People wonder,
raised in
and they wonder what's
discussions
going
of
on.
other issues, right? They say, oh, but wait a minute, we've got the school building coming up, we've got the school, so it's already on people's minds, and I
We have to
just think
figure out a
that-
way how to make it work.
Yeah, and I think we can. I think that we'll come up with something. So,
And you've determined the September meeting will be taped.
I think the
so,
September
yeah,
meeting
place
should be
for that.
taped, if that's okay.
Skip the Board of Select.
The way.
Planning
All
board.
right.
Not a winner on
But
that
we
one.
will look at it on a case-by-case basis each meeting and say, does this need to be taped? And if everyone's okay, at my discretion, we'll figure out whether or not we need them. But for now, let's say, once the agenda comes together too, I think we'll have a better sense. And we can always sort of change, but for now, let's plan on the meeting being taped.
I just have a suggestion to consider. I don't know if it's more efficient to have it take place at the police station, but when we're at the police station with our meetings, it's on TV live.
Okay.
It's set
Is
up
that
that way.
easier?
And
Set it
and Connor doesn't have to
Connor does the magic.
tote the equipment.
Is that easier, Connor?
Well, you should talk about that.
They'll put them on the spot.
Yeah, right.
We can talk about that offline as far
Offline,
as
it's
maybe.
something
Yeah.
to
Put 'em on the
consider.
venue.
It's something to
I don't
consider.
have any objection to moving the meeting.
And certainly
Broke some sort of wall.
the room accommodates more seating than this if you were to have more public
Right,
come
right.
and attend.
Okay. All right. Any other discussion on this? No? Okay. So we need to approve the minutes for May 2nd, 2019.
So moved.
Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carried. We need to approve May 28th, 2019 minutes. Oh, is there any discussion?
A lot of discussion.
So moved.
Second. Any discussion?
There you go.
No. All in favor? Any opposed? Okay. Is there any new business? Nope. Can I get a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
Any discussion? All in favor?
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone.